For most of his life, the most famous surname in American real estate was, technically, wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a typo, wrong in the sense that it had been quietly rebuilt, generation by generation, to something more comfortable to say out loud in New York City. The man behind it built towers with his name in gold letters 40 feet high. He ran for president twice on the strength of that name. And almost nobody watching knew that the name itself was the result of a 200-year negotiation between a small German village, a family that wanted to disappear into America, and a father who once told the world his children were Swedish. That's the starting point. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, just a question that turns out to have layers. Where does Donald Trump actually come from? And what happens when you follow the paper trail and the DNA trail all the way back? The answer splits cleanly into two rivers. One runs through a wine-growing village in Bavaria. The other runs through a windswept island in the Outer Hebrides, off the northwest coast of Scotland. Both rivers carry immigrants who left with almost nothing. Both carry a family secret. And when genealogists and genetic researchers eventually mapped them out, they found something almost nobody expected. A story about eviction, reinvention, and land, arriving generations later at a family whose entire fortune was built on land. Let's start with the name. In the German region of Bavaria, in a town called Kallstadt, there's a parish record for a family that spelled its name Drumpf, sometimes Drumpft. Genealogists trace it back to a man named Johann Philipp Drumpft, born in the late 1600s, during the long, brutal aftermath of the 30 Years' War, a period when a German's surnames shifted constantly as families moved, rebuilt, and became Trump. It wasn't a rebrand, it was just what happens to a name over 200 years of European record-keeping. The man who carried that name to America was Friedrich Trump, Frederick later on, born in Kallstadt in 1869. At 16 years old in 1885, he left. Historians who've studied the immigration records from that era point to a fairly mundane but powerful reason so many young Bavarian men left at exactly that age. Mandatory military conscription was coming for them, and leaving before it arrived was a common, almost routine escape route for teenage boys in wine country villages like Kallstadt. Friedrich arrived in New York with very little and did what a lot of immigrants without capital did. He worked as a barber. But the real turn in his story happened a few years later out west, during the Klondike Gold Rush. Friedrich didn't mine gold. He fed places where a hot meal and a bed were worth more than the gold itself. It's the first appearance of a pattern that would define the family for the next century. The Trumpfs didn't chase the resource. They built the structure the resource chasers needed and charged for access to it. There's a detail in the Klondike chapter that historians researching the family have highlighted specifically. Friedrich's lodging and restaurant operations in Gold Rush. Boomtowns weren't just food and beds. Contemporary accounts of that era describe these establishments as full-service operations, catering to men flush with cash and far from any social oversight. Restaurants, hotels, and adjoining entertainment all under one roof. It was a business model built entirely around extracting value from other people's risk-taking without taking on the risk yourself. That's not incidental texture. It's the first working version of a strategy the family would return to again and again across the next century. Identify where large amounts of money are about to move, and build the structure that sits in its path. Friedrich eventually returned to Kallstadt, married a woman from the same village, Elizabeth Christ, and brought her back to New York, where the family put down roots in Queens. Their son, Fred Trump, was born in 1905. He started in construction and eventually put up apartment buildings across Brooklyn and Queens. The foundation Donald Trump would later inherit and expand. Here's where the story gets strange. Fred Trump was a second-generation German-American, raised in a German-speaking household in a German immigrant neighborhood. And yet, for decades, Fred Trump told people his family was Swedish, not German, Swedish. Historians and biographers who've dug into this point to timing and motive. Fred Trump was building his real estate business through the 1930s and 40s, a period of intense anti-German sentiment in the United States, first because of rising Nazism in Europe, then because of the Second World War itself. A German name on a Brooklyn building at that exact moment carried risk. Many of Fred Trump's tenants and business contacts were Jewish New Yorkers, and biographers have connected his invented Swedish ancestry directly to a desire to avoid the anti-German suspicion and the anti-Semitism adjacent tensions that a German surname could trigger in that specific business, in that specific decade. The claim stuck for a remarkably long time. Donald Trump repeated the Swedish origin story himself for years, well into adulthood, even after the German records were publicly available. It wasn't until later, after journalists and genealogists laid out the Kallstadt paper trail in detail, that the family's German roots became the openly acknowledged version of the story. So that's one river. German, working class, opportunistic, built on hospitality for hire. During a gold rush, then quietly rewritten as Swedish for 2 generations to survive the politics of mid-century New York. Now for the other river, and this one comes with a twist nobody in the Trump organization's marketing department would have chosen. Donald Trump's mother, Mary Ann MacLeod, was born in 1918 on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, about as far from Manhattan, culturally and geographically, as you can get while still speaking English. Her father, Malcolm Callan MacLeod, and her mother, Mary Jane Smith, raised her in a village called Vattisker, with the Smith side of the family rooted nearby in Southlocks. This was crofting country. Small tenant farms, fishing, a hard subsistence life shaped by weather and landlords rather than markets and skylines. At 18 years old, the day after her birthday, Mary MacLeod boarded a ship called the RMS Transylvania in Glasgow and sailed for New York. She arrived with limited means and, according to the immigration and biographical record, took work as a domestic maid, cleaning houses for wealthier New Yorkers. Around 1935, she met Fred Trump. They married, and the daughter of a Hebridean crofting family became, within a generation, the matriarch of one of the most recognizable real estate dynasties in American history. That's a good story on its own. But the genealogists who traced the MacLeod and Smith lines back through the Isle of Lewis found something that gives the whole family history an edge of irony that's almost too clean to be real, except it's fully documented. Between roughly 1750 and 1860, the Scottish Highlands and Islands went through what's now called the Highland Clearances, a prolonged, often forced displacement of thousands of tenant farmers evicted from land their families had worked for generations, so that landowners could convert it to more profitable use, mainly large-scale sheep farming. Historians studying the region estimate that around 70,000 people were forced off highland and island land during this period. Some families were resettled. Many were pushed toward the coasts, toward emigration ships, toward exactly the kind of desperate departure that would eventually put Mary MacLeod's own ancestors on a path off the island. Genealogical researchers, looking specifically at Mary MacLeod's family line, found that both branches, the MacLeods and the Smiths, were affected by exactly this pattern of eviction and displacement in the generations before her birth. Her ancestors weren't bystanders to the clearances. They were among the people the clearances happened to. It helps to understand what that displacement actually looked like on the ground, because cleared undersells it. Landowners across the highlands and islands, motivated by the far higher profits available from large-scale sheep grazing than from traditional tenant crofting, terminated leases en masse, and, in many documented cases, physically removed families and burned the roof timbers of their homes to prevent resettlement. Entire communities that had farmed the same strips of land for generations were relocated to marginal coastal ground, pushed into fishing, or funneled directly onto emigration ships bound for Canada, Australia, and the United States. The Isle of Lewis was not spared from this pattern, and the MacLeod and Smith households researchers have traced Sit squarely inside the decades when it was happening. By the time Mary MacLeod was born in 1918, the worst of the clearances themselves were a century in the past, but the economic aftershock never fully left the island. Crofting communities remained poor, opportunities remained scarce, and a one-way ticket to America remained one of the only realistic paths to something more than subsistence. That's the actual, unglamorous context behind her decision to board the Transylvania at 18. It wasn't wanderlust. It was the same displacement logic that had been reshaping her family's options for 100 years, simply arriving at its final personal stage. Sit with that for a second, because here's the part that makes it genuinely remarkable, not just a quirky footnote. 2 generations after Mary MacLeod's own family was displaced from land by landlords maximizing its value, her son built one of the largest private real estate empires in the United States, acquiring land, developing it, and, in the ordinary course of that business, being on the landlord's side of tenant disputes himself. The family went from being evicted to evicting, not through some poetic act of revenge or design. Nobody planned this, but through the blunt, generational math of immigration, assimilation, and American capitalism. It's the kind of detail that a novelist would be accused of forcing if it appeared in fiction. In the documented genealogy, it's just what happened. So now we have both rivers mapped. German hospitality entrepreneurs from a Bavarian wine village, rewritten as Swedish for 2 generations, and Scottish Island farmers displaced by the clearances, whose granddaughter married into the German line and helped build a fortune on land in New York. Which brings us to the DNA, and where the story has to get more careful, not less interesting. Here's an important distinction, and it matters more than it sounds like it should. As far as the public record shows, Donald Trump has never released a personal DNA test, and no publicly documented genetic sample from him has been analyzed by any of the major commercial ancestry companies. Everything about the German and Scottish origin story that we just walked through comes from documentary genealogy, immigration records, parish registers, ship manifests, census data, and biographical research, not from a swab of Donald Trump's own cheek. So what does DNA actually add to this story? This is where commercial genetic ancestry databases come in. The huge reference panels built by companies that process millions of customer DNA samples and map British and Irish genetic signature, a strong French and German signature, and smaller pockets of Scandinavian ancestry showing up in some of the data. Oh, an echo, interestingly, of that old Swedish cover story, even though the documentary evidence is unambiguously German. And that last detail is worth pausing on. It's not that the DNA data proves the Swedish story true. It doesn't. The documentary record is clear that the German line traces to Kallstadt, full stop. But Scandinavian genetic signals aren't unusual for people with German ancestry, especially German ancestry, rooted in certain regions with historical Norse and Germanic population overlap. So what you get is a strange, almost accidental coincidence. A genetic echo that sounds like it's confirming a lie Fred Trump told to protect his business, when it's actually just an unrelated feature of deep European population history. This is also where it's worth being precise about what DNA testing can and can't tell. Because a lot of viral content blurs this line. Documentary genealogy, the birth records, the ship manifests, the parish registers can tell you exactly who your great-great-grandfather was, where he lived, and when he got on a boat. DNA testing, by contrast, is a population-level tool. It's extremely good at estimating broad regional ancestry proportions. How much of your genetic material traces to Northwestern Europe versus, say, Southern Europe or West Africa, and at finding living relatives who share detectable segments of DNA with you. It is not, on its own, a tool for confirming a single specific ancestor's identity or a specific migration date. The two methods work best together. Records give you names and dates. DNA gives you population-level confirmation and can catch errors, like a family myth about Swedish ancestry, that records alone might not resolve. In the Trump family's case, the documentary genealogy did the heavy lifting. Genealogists working independently through platforms that specialize in matching immigration and parish records reconstructed both the Kallstadt line and the Isle of Lewis line in detail, cross-referencing ship manifests, census entries, and local parish books. The commercial DNA database patterns for the surname function as a kind of corroborating background signal, broadly consistent with British, Irish, French, and German origins, which lines up with what the records already showed, but not a substitute for the records themselves. It's also worth understanding, briefly, how those commercial reference panels actually work, because it explains why they're useful here, despite never having tested Trump directly. Companies that offer consumer DNA ancestry testing build their regional estimates by comparing a customer's raw genetic data against reference populations, large pools of people with well-documented, multi-generational roots in a specific region, whose DNA effectively defines what German or Scottish or Scandinavian looks like at the genetic level. When millions of customers run through that comparison, patterns emerge for shared surnames, because surnames are inherited alongside broad ancestral geography far more often than not. That's the entire basis for saying that people named Trump, in aggregate, skew British and Irish and French and German. It's not a claim about one man's genome. It's a population-level echo of the same migration story the paper trail already tells, which is exactly why documentary genealogists treat it as supporting evidence rather than as the primary source. Step back and look at the whole arc, and there's a pattern that runs through it that has nothing to do with genetics at all. This is a family that has spent 3 generations actively managing the story of where it came from. The ordinary erosion of immigrant record-keeping. Not a deliberate rebrand, but not resisted either. Fred Trump made a much more deliberate choice, swapping German for Swedish at a moment when German ancestry was a professional liability in his specific business, with his specific tenants, in his specific decade. And Donald Trump inherited that edited version and carried it forward for years, even as journalists and genealogists were actively publishing the real Kallstadt paper trail. None of this required a conspiracy or a formal cover-up. It's a much more human and much more American pattern. Immigrant families editing their own origin stories to fit whatever version of belonging the current moment rewards. German became a liability, so it became Swedish. 2 generations later, once assimilation was complete and German ancestry carried no particular stigma in American life, the truth resurfaced without much resistance because there was nothing left to protect. The maternal Scottish side of the story never needed editing in the same way. Scottish ancestry never carried the same social cost in mid-century America that German ancestry briefly did. That's likely part of why Mary Ann McLeod's origin story stayed consistent and public throughout her life, while Fred Trump's kept shifting. It wasn't about which story was true, it was about which story was useful. Put the two family lines side by side, and the Trumpf family's American story is really a story about the two dominant forces that shaped so much of transatlantic immigration in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Economic push from rural land systems that no longer had room for the people working them, and the pull of American cities that would take almost anyone willing to work. Friedrich Trump left Kallstadt to avoid conscription and built a business, feeding gold rush prospectors who wanted the resource without doing the resource's dirty, dangerous work himself. Mary MacLeod left an island where her own family had already been pushed off ancestral land by the Highland clearances, and became a domestic worker in the city that would eventually make her descendants some of the most prominent private landholders in the country. Two very different departures, one financially opportunistic, one shaped by generations of displacement, that converged by pure historical accident in a marriage in 1930s New York. And the DNA record, limited as it is without a direct sample from Donald Trump himself, does what population genetics is actually good at. It doesn't overturn any of this. It quietly backs it up. British and Irish, French and German, a trace of Scandinavian that turns out to be a coincidence, not a confession. The genetic picture, such as it exists in the available data, sits comfortably underneath the documentary record that was already detailed enough to stand on its own. What makes this story genuinely interesting isn't a hidden bombshell. There's no secret royal bloodline, no unexpected continent, no scandal buried in a parish register. What makes it interesting is how ordinary the underlying material is. Conscription-age emigration, gold rush hustling, forced land clearances, wartime ethnic anxiety, a name quietly reshaped over 2 centuries. And how extraordinary the outcome turned out to be. A Bavarian barber's grandson and a Hebridean maid's son inherited both family lines, built an empire on American land, and spent decades curating which half of that story the public got to hear. The paper trail is public now. The DNA database patterns line up with it, and somewhere in that combination is the actual answer to the question the title promises. Not a secret, but a coincidence so specific. Evicted tenants becoming landlords in exactly 2 generations, that it reads like it was written on purpose when it wasn't. If there's a version of this story you think deserves more digging, the Kallstadt side, the Highland clearances, or what commercial DNA databases can and can't actually prove about a single family, say which one in the comments, and that's where we go next.